The invitation had arrived on a Thursday, written in Lady Ashworth's elegant copperplate, and Miss Marple had accepted it on Friday, not because she had any particular opinion about Thornfield Manor's famous rose garden, but because Lady Cecily Ashworth had underlined the word soon 3 times, and underlined words, in Miss Marple's considerable experience, always meant something other than what they said. Thornfield Manor stood at the end of a lane lined with chestnut trees, their spring canopy filtering the afternoon light into something almost theatrical. The house itself was handsome in the way that old money tends to be handsome, a little too assured, a little too symmetrical, with windows that watched the approaching drive like a row of politely suspicious eyes. Miss Marple stepped from the taxi, patted her traveling bag, and took a long, deliberate look before she moved a single step toward the front door. The other guests were not expected until Saturday. Today was Friday. That, she had reason on the train, was precisely the point. Mrs. Pringle, the housekeeper, answered before the bell had finished its second peal. She was a compact, flour-dusted woman with the look of someone who had been carrying a secret just slightly too long and was beginning to feel the weight of it in her shoulders. She welcomed Miss Marple with genuine relief, the kind of relief one reserves not for a pleasant visitor, but for an anticipated ally. "Her ladyship is in the conservatory," Mrs. Pringle said, taking Miss Marple's coat with practiced efficiency. "She'll be so pleased you've come early." "We all are." The "we all" was interesting. Miss Marple filed it away with the particular care she gave to collective pronouns. She was shown to the yellow guest room first, a cheerful space that smelled of beeswax and slightly anxious fresh flowers, and on her way she passed the drawing room. The door stood open. She paused, quite naturally, quite innocently, and allowed her eyes to travel the room with the calm thoroughness of a woman who has spent 80-some years noticing what other people overlook. There, on the broad stone windowsill facing the garden, was a boot print. A single one, pressed in reddish clay, now thoroughly dry. The heel faced the garden. The toe faced the room. Someone had come in through that window, not out. Moreover, the print was easily a size 11, far beyond any of the 3 housemaids' misses Pringle had mentioned, and considerably beyond Lord Ashworth himself, who had been described to Miss Marple by a mutual acquaintance as a slight, bookish man who favored indoor slippers. Miss Marple said nothing. She continued to her room. Lady Cecily Ashworth met her in the conservatory 20 minutes later, surrounded by orchids she clearly hadn't planted herself, and holding a glass of lemon water she clearly hadn't poured herself either. She was perhaps 55, still lovely in the manner of women who have always known they were lovely, with ash-blonde hair and a coral dress and a smile of absolute warmth that stopped, precisely and noticeably, just below her cheekbones. "Jane, dear, you look marvelous." Cecily kissed the air beside Miss Marple's cheek. "I do hope the journey wasn't beastly." "Not at all. The countryside was beautiful." Miss Marple settled into a wicker chair and accepted lemon water. "And Lord Ashworth? Is he well?" A pause, perhaps 2 beats longer than comfort required. "He's resting. He's been rather tired lately. Business things." Cecily waved one manicured hand. "You know how men become." "Indeed," said Miss Marple pleasantly. It was Mrs. Pringle who told her about the solicitor, later, over a cup of very strong tea in the kitchen, the kind of kitchen conversation that happens when a housekeeper has been waiting for precisely the right listener. Mr. Godfrey Price, of Price and Clement, had arrived the previous Tuesday without an appointment. The argument that followed had been conducted behind the study door, but Mrs. Pringle had heard enough. The phrase that is simply not legal, Reginald delivered at a pitch suggesting the speaker felt quite strongly about what was and was not legal, and the sound of something, a book, a paperweight, striking a wooden surface. Mr. Price had left without staying for tea. "And Lord Ashworth after?" Miss Marple asked. "Quiet, Mum. Very quiet. Like a man who's been told something he suspected but didn't want confirmed." Miss Marple nodded slowly and said nothing further on the subject. But after Mrs. Pringle returned to her pastry, she sat very still with her tea, thinking about boot prints facing the wrong direction and solicitors arriving without appointments. and a woman's smile that knew how to go just so far and no further. On her way to dress for dinner, she tried the library door. It was locked. Solid, new locked, with the kind of firmness that says the lock has been recently changed rather than simply recently used. There was a keyhole in the old brass escutcheon, and below it, on the polished floor, a single small scratch, fresh and bright, where a second key had been cut and the original filed. Miss Marple looked at the scratch for a long moment. Somewhere in the east wing, a door closed. Footsteps moved away rather quickly, and from behind the library door, just audible, came the soft and unmistakable sound of someone turning a page. Dinner at Thornfield Manor was served at 8, by candlelight, with the kind of elaborate casualness that requires considerable effort to achieve. The table had been laid for 8. Miss Marple arrived precisely on time, which gave her the inestimable advantage of watching everyone else arrive after her. Felix Drummond came first, which was the sort of thing that told you a great deal about a young man. He was perhaps 32, arrestingly handsome in a way that had probably caused him considerable trouble over the years, with dark eyes that moved around the room in the swift, assessing way of someone who is always calculating the value of his surroundings. He wore his dinner jacket with practiced ease and introduced himself to Miss Marple with a smile of such spectacular sincerity that she liked him slightly less for it. Then came the Whitmore sisters, Eleanor, the elder, angular and watchful, and Harriet, the younger, soft-voiced and given to touching her pearl necklace at intervals as though reassuring herself it remained. They had been at school with Lady Ashworth, apparently, which explained their presence if not entirely their expressions, which were the expressions of women attending an occasion they have complicated feelings about. Dr. Nathaniel Carew arrived next, a retired physician of perhaps 65 with a red face and a heartiness that Miss Marple associated, in her experience, with men who drink more carefully than they appear to. He greeted Lord Ashworth, who had descended, pale but composed, in a jacket that hung slightly loosely on him, with the excessive bonhomie of an old friend who feels, perhaps, a shade of guilt in the friendship. The final guest was Mrs. Vivian Shalcott, a widow of indeterminate age and considerable jewelry, who swept in at 3 minutes past 8 with the serene confidence of someone who has never once in her life felt she owed anyone punctuality. She kissed Cecily on both cheeks, told Lord Ashworth he looked distinguished, and settled into her chair with the ease of a woman who has been the most interesting person in many rooms. 8 chairs, 7 guests plus Miss Marple, Lord Ashworth at the head. The soup was consumed with the general murmur of polite reacquaintance. Miss Marple ate, listened, and observed. Felix Drummond spoke a great deal about a renovation project in Wiltshire, spoke of it, in fact, with the particular emphasis of a man establishing an alibi for his finances. Eleanor Whitmore asked Lord Ashworth twice about the estate plans, and was deflected both times. Harriet touched her pearls. Dr. Carew refilled his glass with the practiced subtlety of long habit. It was during the fish course that Mrs. Pringle's youngest housemaid, a girl called, pink-cheeked and clearly nervous, leaned between Miss Marple and Lord Ashworth to clear a side plate, and, in the process of doing so, managed with extraordinary smoothness to exchange Lord Ashworth's half-drunk wine glass for a fresh one poured from a different decanter. The movement was deft, accomplished, the kind of smooth that is not natural but trained. No one else appeared to notice. Miss Marple appeared not to notice either, which required some effort. She did, however, allow her gaze to drift, just briefly and quite casually, toward the original glass as Dot moved away with it. It was held at precisely the angle that caught the candlelight. And from her seat, Miss Marple caught the faintest breath of something on the air, something beneath the wine, beneath the beeswax candles and the hothouse flowers, something sharp and sweet and entirely wrong. Bitter almonds. Very faint, but unmistakable to someone who had encountered it once before, many decades ago, in a case that had concluded badly for the gentleman in question. Lord Ashworth, across the table, set down his fork. His color, which had already been indifferent, took a further step in the wrong direction. He pressed his napkin to his mouth with the careful deliberation of a man maintaining composure through an act of will. "Forgive me," he said quietly, to no one in particular. "I find I'm rather done in this evening. Do carry on." He pushed back his chair, offered the table a small, strained smile, and walked from the room with the measured pace of someone who did not wish to appear to hurry. He did not come back. Pudding was served. Conversation resumed, in a rather more animated register, as though the room itself had drawn a breath. Felix Drummond laughed too loudly at something Dr. Carew said. Mrs. Shalcott's eyes moved toward the door and back again with the practiced indifference of a woman who notices everything she pretends not to. Miss Marple ate her syllabub and thought about decanters. Specifically, she thought about who among these 7 people would have known that Lord Ashworth preferred the 1947 Burgundy on formal evenings. It was not information one found in a letter of invitation. It was not information that a casual acquaintance would hold. It was, by its nature, the knowledge of someone who had sat at this table before, many times, and recently, and with attention to detail that went beyond social appreciation of good wine. She set down her spoon. The candles guttered in a draft from the east corridor. Somewhere above them, a floorboard creaked. Sleep, Miss Marple had found over the years, was a commodity that visited her on its own schedule and could not be hurried. At midnight, she lay quite comfortably awake in the yellow room, listening to Thornfield Manor settle around her the way old houses do. A creak here, a sigh there, the whole ancient structure conducting its nightly conversation with gravity and time. It was the garden light that caught her attention first. Not an electric light, something carried. A torch, held low and moving in a manner that suggested the carrier knew the grounds well and wished, very much, not to be seen from the upper windows. Miss Marple rose without any particular rush, put on her dressing gown and her sensible slippers, and moved to the window with the unhurried precision of a woman who has learned that the universe rewards patience. The figure was a man. She could tell that much from the breadth of the shoulders and the length of the stride. He crossed the rear lawn in the direction of the trees that marked the boundary of the old kitchen garden, moving with a purposeful quiet that spoke of a destination already decided. He carried something in his right hand, a leather satchel, dark-colored, square-cornered, the kind of bag that a professional man carries documents in rather than a week's laundry. Miss Marple watched until he disappeared into the tree line, then stayed at the window a moment longer, directing her gaze to the right, toward the low stone structure that sat at the garden's far eastern edge. The ice house. It had not been in use, Lady Cecily had mentioned at tea, for 20 years or more. She was still at the window when the door to the landing opened softly, and Dot appeared, clearly not expecting anyone, carrying a glass of warm milk and wearing the expression of someone who has been crying quietly for some time and hoped no one could tell. "Oh, miss, I'm so sorry I didn't." "Don't be silly, child," Miss Marple said kindly. "You couldn't sleep either. Come in a moment. I won't bite." Dot came in. She was perhaps 19, and the kind of nervous that comes not from a naturally anxious temperament, but from recent and specific cause. She sat in the room's small armchair and held her milk in both hands and told Miss Marple, without much prompting, that 3 weeks ago Lord Ashworth had asked Mrs. Pringle to reassign all the East Wing housemaids to the West. No explanation offered, just a request that had the unmistakable flavor of an instruction. "And was that unusual?" Miss Marple asked. "Very, Mum. The East Wing has the library, and Lord Ashworth usually liked it dusted every other day. He's particular about it." She paused. "Was particular, I suppose. He's not been himself." Miss Marple thanked her, sent her to bed, and then put on her second cardigan and went, very quietly, very carefully, down the servants' stair and out through the scullery door to the garden. The icehouse padlock was new. Strikingly, obviously new against the old iron of the hasp, the metal still bright with an absence of tarnish that measured its age in weeks rather than years. It was, she noted with great interest, a Hartley & Sons lever padlock. The same manufacturer, the same model year, she was quite certain, as the lock that had been placed on the library door. The same key, then. Or very possibly, the same person with the same locksmith's receipt and the same reason for sudden, urgent privacy. The torch-carrying man did not re-emerge from the ice house while she stood there. She did not wait indefinitely. That way lay chills and questions she was not yet ready to answer with certainty. She went back inside instead, moving through the dark kitchen with the easy confidence of someone who has always been comfortable in dark kitchens. It was as she rounded the foot of the main staircase that she remembered the satchel. Dinner. Felix Drummond's chair. She had registered it at the time and set it aside, as one does with information that has not yet found its context. A leather satchel, dark brown, with square brass corners and a monogrammed strap buckle. She hadn't been able to read the monogram at the distance, but the satchel itself was distinctive. The same shape, the same square-cornered profile as the one the figure had carried across the garden. Miss Marple climbed the stairs, moving past the first landing with her eyes turned, quite naturally, toward the east corridor. Lady Ashworth's room was at the far end, identifiable by the thin line of light beneath the door. As Miss Marple watched, a shadow passed across that line, and then came back, and passed again, the rhythm of a person pacing, back and forth, at 1 in the morning, with the steady, mechanical quality of someone who cannot stop thinking about something they very much wish they could. The yellow room was warm and the bed was comfortable, and Miss Marple lay awake until nearly 3, arranging what she knew into the shapes it wanted to make, and thinking about keys and satchels, and men who knew a garden well enough to cross it in the dark without once looking at the ground. Lord Ashworth did not appear at breakfast. This was announced by Lady Cecily at the sideboard, between the kedgeree and the toast rack, with an ease so well practiced that it might have been entirely genuine. He had spent an uncomfortable night, she said. Dr. Carew, who had turned rather pink and was addressing himself to his bacon with unnecessary concentration, had looked in on him first thing and pronounced it a digestive episode of no great concern. Miss Marple accepted this information, helped herself to an egg, and watched Felix Drummond enter the breakfast room from the garden door at 7 minutes past 9. His shoes were clean, conspicuously clean, in the manner of shoes that have been very recently wiped. His heels, however, told another story. There was a faint residue of pale clay in the seam of the left one, where the sole meets the upper, the kind of spot a man in a hurry tends to miss. He sat down, poured coffee with a steady hand, and wished the table a cheerful good morning. Miss Marple ate her egg. After breakfast, she found herself in the morning room with Eleanor Whitmore, who proved to be one of those invaluable conversational types. The woman who believes herself to be discreet while being, in practice, a remarkably efficient transmitter of information. Eleanor had strong opinions about what other people did with their money, and those opinions, given the slightest encouragement, had a tendency to find their way out. The encouragement required was modest. Miss Marple mentioned, gently, that she understood Lord Ashworth had been under some strain of late. Eleanor's jaw tightened with satisfaction. Strain? Yes, one might say so. When a man of his age decides to revise arrangements he's maintained for 30 years, there's generally a reason. And the reason is generally that someone has been tiresome. She touched her teacup. He spoke to my brother-in-law's firm. Not to change everything, mind you. But someone who had expected rather a lot was apparently expecting rather too much, and Reginald apparently agreed. Someone close to the family? Miss Marple murmured. Eleanor pressed her lips together in a way that meant yes without any of the legal liability of saying it aloud, and changed the subject to the hydrangeas. Miss Marple took a constitutional through the ground floor after that, passing through the drawing room with the unhurried air of a woman appreciating the architecture. The fireplace held the remains of a fire laid but not fully burned. Someone had used the grate in the past 24 hours, despite the warmth of the season, for the specific purpose of committing paper to flame. The job had been somewhat hurried. Among the black curls of ash, one corner of heavier writing paper had survived, pressed against the iron back of the grate. Perhaps 2 square inches of cream stock, slightly scorched at the edges, with 4 lines of ink still legible. As we agreed, destroy after. Cannot afford for R, to know before the. Trust that you will be. The handwriting was small, even, and slightly compressed on the downstrokes. The hand of someone who had learned to write formally and had written a great deal since. Miss Marple had seen that handwriting that morning. Very briefly, Mrs. Vivian Chalcott's dressing case had been in the front hall awaiting repositioning to a different guest room, and the case had been open, just briefly, just enough, to show the writing case within it, and the note tucked in the outside pocket, and the signature at the bottom of that note, before a housemaid had snapped the case shut with appropriate discretion. V. And beneath it, underlined, destroy this. Miss Marple stood in the drawing room for a moment and considered what it meant when a woman sent a letter to a house instructing the recipient to destroy all correspondence, and then accepted an invitation to that house, to sleep under the same roof as the recipient 3 days later. It meant, she thought, one of two things. Either Mrs. Chalcott did not trust the letter to have been destroyed and wished to ensure it herself, or Mrs. Chalcott had changed the plan and wished to be present for whatever came next. Neither interpretation was comfortable. She went out to the garden, where the roses were very beautiful in the late morning light, and found she had rather a great deal to think about. Lunch was a lighter affair than dinner, a cold buffet arranged on the sideboard, with the guests helping themselves and finding seats with the slightly fractured informality of a house party that has begun to feel its tensions. Lord Ashworth appeared at 12:45. Looking, Miss Marple thought, like a man who had made a decision about something and was not entirely at peace with it, but had passed the point of reversal. He ate very little. He spoke politely to Mrs. Chalcott, who sat beside him and managed the conversation with superb social skill, never once allowing her eyes to carry the emotion that Miss Marple suspected her internal state might be generating. He drank water. He did not touch the general teapot. Lady Cecily poured his tea herself from a small pot that had been set separately on the sideboard. She carried it to him with the solicitous air of a devoted wife. He thanked her. He drank it. He excused himself at 1:20 and was not seen again for the remainder of the afternoon. Miss Marple went to the garden after lunch and spent a pleasant half-hour talking with Tom, the head gardener, about the propagation of climbing roses, during which Tom, who was 71, sharp-eyed, and held the particular authority of a man who has known a family for decades, mentioned, with the casualness of someone who doesn't realize what he's saying, that he had seen Lord Ashworth and Mrs. Chalcott together in the village of Thornwick 6 weeks ago. Coming out of old Price's office, Tom said, deadheading a stem. Didn't look like they'd had a jolly time of it. She was ahead of him on the step, and he had that look. You know the look, when a man's just signed something he wished he hadn't. Did they speak to each other outside? Miss Marple asked. Not a word. Went opposite directions up the lane. He paused. Odd, I thought, since they'd arrived together. At 3 o'clock, Miss Marple was passing the library and tried the handle from long habit. It turned. She entered quietly, leaving the door ajar, and moved through the room with practiced efficiency. The library was handsome. Tall shelves, good light from north-facing windows, a reading table of pleasant proportions. She noted the geography of it and moved methodically. It was the third shelf from the left, in the section marked History, County Records, where one volume stood slightly proud of its neighbors, as though recently replaced by someone who had not taken the time to push it fully back. Miss Marple drew it out. Behind it, set into the shelf itself, was a shallow compartment, perhaps 12 inches wide, 8 inches tall, 3 inches deep. A simple wooden door on small brass hinges. The hinges, she noted, had been recently oiled. The ghost of an oil mark was visible on the shelf below, a small rounded smear not more than a week old. The compartment was empty. Whatever it had held was gone. She heard footsteps in the corridor. She replaced the book, moved to the window, and was examining the view with a general air of botanical interest when the door opened, and then, finding the room apparently empty of anything interesting, closed again. The lock clicked. Miss Marple waited a courteous interval, then tried the handle. Locked again. She went toward the estate office on her way back through the ground floor, and heard, before she reached the door, Dr. Carew's voice. Not the words, just the tone. He was speaking in the low, urgent register of a man conveying something he did not want overheard, and he was speaking quickly. As her footsteps reached the door, the voice stopped. Not tapered. Stopped. There was a silence of several seconds, and then the receiver clicked into its cradle. Miss Marple passed the door without pausing. She went upstairs and sat for some time by her window, looking out at the garden and thinking about compartments. The nature of a hidden compartment, she considered, is not simply that it hides things. Any drawer can do that. The nature of a hidden compartment is that its existence is itself the secret. Only those who know where it is would think to look. Only those who put something there would think to take it. And the document that had presumably occupied that space for some period of time had been removed within the past week. While preparations for this house party were underway, while guests were being invited, rooms prepared, menus planned, while someone arranged a house full of people and created, quite deliberately, an occasion at which any number of people might be credited with almost anything, Miss Marple looked at the garden. The afternoon light lay golden and perfectly peaceful across the grass, and a blackbird sang from the copper beech. And somewhere in the house, she was quite certain, someone was very frightened indeed. Harriet Whitmore found Miss Marple in the morning room before breakfast, and she found her the way people always found Miss Marple in the early hours, not because they had been looking, but because she had, in some indefinable way, made herself findable. She was there, and she was quiet, and the room smelled of Earl Grey, and Harriet had not slept properly in 2 days and was very tired of carrying something alone. She sat down. She twisted her pearls. She said, "I don't know whether I should say this." Often the things we're unsure about saying are the most worth saying, Miss Marple replied, which was not entirely true but was true enough for the occasion. Harriet had been in the gallery corridor at 2:30 the previous afternoon, looking at the family portraits, which she did when she was anxious because the portraits reminded her that most human drama resolves eventually, one way or another. She had seen Mrs. Shalcott come along the passage from the main stair and go into Lord Ashworth's study without knocking. She had waited, not from suspicion, Harriet insisted, just from a sort of paralysis, not knowing whether to proceed or retreat, and 20 minutes later Mrs. Shalcott had come out again. Her expression, Harriet said carefully, was very composed. The way someone looks when they've just done something that needed doing and they've done it, and they feel it's finished. "Did she see you?" Miss Marple asked. "I don't think so." She went straight back, toward the main stair. Miss Marple thanked her warmly and sent her toward the kedgeree, and then sat for a moment with her tea before walking through the ground floor with her customary air of benign perambulation. The estate office door was, for once, standing open, left so, perhaps, by whoever had used the telephone at such speed the previous afternoon. The desk diary lay on the blotter, and Miss Marple was not the sort of woman who read other people's private papers, but a desk diary left open in a room with an open door is very nearly a public document, and the entry she could see from the doorway was quite clear. Wed. Forsyth and Clement. 10 a.m. Cancelled. Do not reschedule. Written in Lord Ashworth's hand. Underlined. The word cancelled pressed so firmly the pen had left a slight embossment. She went to the ice house after that, by the garden path, walking slowly and looking at roses. The stone step before the ice house door bore marks she had not examined on her previous visit. Her attention then had been on the padlock. Now she looked carefully at the step itself. 2 prints, both partial, both from a heel, small, oval, with the distinctive narrow arc imprint of a Cuban heel, separated by a stride that suggested someone moving quickly. The clay here was slower to dry than on the window ledge, and these marks were not more than 24 hours old. At dressing time, moving along the corridor to change for dinner, she passed Mrs. Shalcott's room. The door stood ajar. Mrs. Shalcott was at her mirror, and beside the door, on the low shoe stand that the housemaids used for overnight polishing, sat a pair of walking shoes. Tan leather, Cuban heel, narrow oval tip. Miss Marple looked. She moved on. Lord Ashworth came to dinner. He came in good color, with a direct eye and something in his bearing that might, if one wished to be optimistic, be called restored vigor. He greeted the table with the easy warmth of a host fully comfortable in his own house, and he ate well, and he drank wine, the communal wine, from the common decanter, without any intervention of substitute glasses. He made a toast to friendship, and to summer, and to Thornfield, and around the table faces arranged themselves into expressions of pleasure or relief or calculation, depending on whose face it was. Miss Marple lifted her glass and watched him over the rim of it, thinking. A man who had been gradually, methodically, she was almost certain, dosed with something that should have made him considerably worse by now had instead rallied overnight. The dosing had presumably been interrupted. Either the method had changed, or the person administering it had reconsidered, or something had passed between parties that altered the plan. 20 minutes in a study. An erased appointment. A woman who looked, according to Harriet, as though something was finished. What if it was? What if Mrs. Shalcott had gone to that study not to harm Lord Ashworth, but to reach some other kind of arrangement entirely? And what if Lord Ashworth had accepted? And what if? The thought arrived quietly, but with great weight. The danger to him came not from one direction, but from two, and one of those directions had not yet been accounted for. He laughed at something Dr. Carew said. He was entirely at ease. He was, in fact, acting like a man with no reason to be afraid, which was, in Miss Marple's experience, one of the most dangerous things a man could do. He was found at 6:15 in the morning, between the standard roses and the low box hedge that bordered the east path, lying on the gravel in a collapse that had fortunately been witnessed by Tom, arriving early to stake the sweet peas, and was therefore discovered in time for anything to be done at all. Lady Cecily, roused by the commotion, arrived in her dressing gown and knelt in the gravel without apparent regard for it. Dr. Carew was summoned. The constable from Thornwick, a sensible young man named Alderton, with a good forehead and the wisdom to say very little, arrived within 20 minutes and established himself in the hall with the quiet authority of someone who understood his role. Miss Marple dressed quickly and thoroughly and was downstairs by 7. She found Dot in the scullery, very pale, washing dishes that didn't need washing. It took very little, just a quieting presence and 2 minutes of silence before the girl began to speak, because the silence that Miss Marple deployed in such moments was not the silence of waiting but the silence of already knowing, and people responded to it without quite understanding why. The instruction to substitute Lord Ashworth's wine glass had come via note. Not spoken, written, slipped under the kitchen door the morning of the dinner party, on plain paper, in handwriting didn't recognize, and signed. It had said that Lord Ashworth's physician had ordered his wine managed, and that a particular decanter, left in the pantry, marked with a strip of white tape, should be used for his glass only. It had said not to mention this, as Lord Ashworth was proud and didn't wish the other guests to know of his condition. It had been convincing. It had been kind, but had done exactly as she was told. Miss Marple spent 10 minutes in the consulting room that had been hastily established for Dr. Carew's equipment, while the doctor was occupied with Lord Ashworth and the constable. She was looking for nothing dramatic, just a quiet, informed look at the contents of a doctor's bag as it sat, open, on the consulting room table. She had chemistry enough, from the decades, to understand what she found. The decanter in the pantry had been sent for analysis. Miss Marple did not need to wait for those results, because Dr. Carew's bag contained a small, brown glass bottle that she recognized by its label, a specific compound used in the treatment of ingestion of certain categories of alkaloid-based substances, used when the substance in question was already present in the body, used, in other words, as a reversal agent. The substituted wine had not been the poison. It had been the antidote. Someone had known that the first glass, the original glass, poured from the main decanter at dinner's start, had already been interfered with, and that same someone had tried, through Dot and the unsigned note, to reverse the damage before it could take full effect, which meant the dosing at dinner had been partially interrupted. But Lord Ashworth had drunk freely at last night's dinner, freely, from the communal decanter, in the full company of his guests. And the decanter had been poured by only one person, Lady Cecily, who had handled the bottle herself at the sideboard, with the serene familiarity of a woman pouring wine in her own house. Miss Marple was crossing the entrance hall when she heard the sound from the library, the sound of files being moved, papers lifted, the quiet industry of someone searching under pressure. The library door was closed, but not locked. She opened it. Felix Drummond stood at the correspondence files with a folder open in his hands. He turned, and for one unguarded moment, she saw his face as it actually was beneath the charm. Frightened, yes, but not guilty. Desperate was the better word. Miss Marple. He set the folder down without closing it. I imagine this looks rather bad. It has a certain appearance, she agreed. What are you looking for? He was quiet for a long moment, then said, a letter. From me to Reginald, written 8 months ago. About a loan. He paused. A letter that was here, in that compartment behind the county records, and that has been removed, and is presumably now being held by someone who intends to use it in a manner I find threatening. Used how? To suggest, Felix said carefully, that I had reason to wish him ill, when in fact I had very good reason to wish him precisely the opposite. He looked at her steadily. He was the only person who could clear a debt I didn't incur, and someone needed a useful suspect. Miss Marple looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the folder he had set down. Then she went to find Constable Alderton. She had one more thing to verify, and she needed to do it before anyone thought to remove the decanter from the sideboard. The drawing room at Thornfield Manor held the particular stillness of a space waiting for something to become true. They were all there. Felix Drummond on the window seat, his charm at temporary rest, the Whitmore sisters side by side on the settee, Eleanor rigid, Harriet clasping her pearls, Dr. Carew by the mantelpiece with the aspect of a man bracing for a diagnosis he has suspected since Tuesday, Mrs. Vivian Shalcott in the high-back chair with her hands folded and her face composed into the steady, watchful expression of someone who has already prepared for this, and Lady Cecily Ashworth, who sat nearest the door in the low chair she always chose, in the pale yellow dress that suited her so very well, with the bright and entirely steady gaze of a woman who believes, up until the very last moment, that intelligence and will are sufficient protection against the truth. Constable Alderton stood near the door. Miss Marple stood, as she generally preferred, near the center of the room, where she could see everyone. Lord Ashworth, she began, has been made ill by a substance introduced, gradually, methodically, and with considerable care, into his food and drink over a period of at least 3 weeks. The intent was not immediate harm, but a slow decline that could be attributed to any of several naturally occurring conditions, leaving no particular question to be answered and no particular person to be doubted. She paused. The room was very still. The person with consistent, intimate access to his food, his personal teapot, and his dining habits is, of course, his wife. That is not, by itself, evidence, but it is the beginning of a pattern, and patterns were always my particular interest. She turned, gently, toward Lady Cecily. The pattern completed itself last evening, when Lord Ashworth drank wine poured by your hand alone from a bottle you handled, Lady Ashworth. The wine was tested this morning. The compound used is an alkaloid extract, slow-acting and cumulative, and it is traceable. Dr. Carew has confirmed it. Carew cleared his throat. He said nothing, but the throat clearing was a kind of yes. The question, Miss Marple continued, is motive, and the motive is this. She took from her cardigan pocket a folded sheet of paper, a copy she had obtained, with Constable Alderton's cooperation, from the files of the solicitor Price. 28 years ago, Lady Cecily Hartington married a man named Geoffrey Sands in a civil ceremony in Edinburgh. That marriage was never formally annulled, legally or otherwise, before her subsequent marriage to Lord Ashworth. She held the paper with great quietness. Mr. Price discovered this while reviewing the estate documentation. He informed Lord Ashworth. Lord Ashworth began the process of consulting new legal counsel, not, as some assumed, to change his will for personal reasons, but to understand the implications for the estate, the title, and a 28-year inheritance arrangement that rested, in its entirety, on a marriage that was never legally valid. The room, which had been still, became something rather deeper than still. Cecily's face did not fall. It rearranged itself, slowly, with immense control, from warmth into something that was not quite anything at all. She said, "You have no proof of intention." "I have the substance in the decanter," Miss Marple said, quite pleasantly. "And I have the receipt from the chemist in Aldingford, where a compound was purchased 6 weeks ago by a woman matching your description, paying in cash. Constable Alderton has already been to Aldingford this morning." The room waited. Cecily looked at the constable. The constable looked at the floor. "The letter," Miss Marple continued, turning to Felix Drummond, who had gone very pale, "was taken from the library compartment by Lady Ashworth, who had known of the compartment's existence for 30 years. It was to be introduced at the appropriate moment as evidence of your grievance against Lord Ashworth. You had none, but a letter asking for a large personal loan, combined with your unexplained garden excursions, would have presented a convincing picture to an inquiring mind less familiar with the whole of the situation." Felix let out a breath that had been held for what appeared to be quite some time. Miss Marple turned, lastly, to Mrs. Shalcott. "You met with Lord Ashworth in Mr. Price's office 6 weeks ago because Price had contacted you as well. You are named in certain documents relating to the estate as a secondary beneficiary of a trust Lord Ashworth created on your behalf many years ago, in connection with a friendship too old and too private to require explanation here. You learned of the danger to him through channels I will not embarrass you by naming, and you attempted, through and an unsigned note, to introduce an antidote to the substance you believed was being used. You came to this house party to watch over him, and to negotiate with Lady Ashworth for the destruction of the letter you had once sent her in confidence." Mrs. Shalcott said nothing, but she looked at Miss Marple with eyes that expressed, quite clearly, both confirmation and relief. Constable Alderton crossed the room. He was kind about it. He was young and sensible, and he was kind. And Lady Cecily Ashworth rose from her chair with extraordinary composure and walked with him toward the door and out of the room and out of Thornfield Manor, in the pale sunlight of a May morning, without once looking back. The room exhaled. Lord Ashworth was sitting up in bed by noon, thin and tired and very much himself, and Miss Marple sat with him for half an hour over tea and spoke very little, because half an hour of quiet company is sometimes the most useful thing one can offer a person who has been through a great deal and needs to begin the business of determining what comes next. She left Thornfield the following morning. Tom walked her to the taxi and said the climbing roses on the south wall were going to be spectacular this year, given the weather, and she said she thought he was probably right. In the lane, beneath the chestnuts, the light was exactly as it had been when she arrived. Filtered, theatrical, the way light gets when it comes through a canopy old enough to have seen everything and decided to remain, on balance, optimistic. Miss Marple settled into the taxi with her bag and her cardigan and her very considerable thoughts, and as Thornfield Manor diminished in the rear window, she reflected, as she sometimes did at the conclusion of these things, that evil is almost never extraordinary. It is almost always domestic. It is the turned lock and the substituted glass and the unsigned note and the patient, methodical rewriting of what is real. The same small deceits she had observed in St. Mary Mead for 50 years, scaled up, dressed finely, given a grander house to work in. No more complex for the grandeur. No more difficult to see, once you knew where to look. The taxi turned onto the main road. The blackbird, somewhere behind her in the copper beech, was still singing. It was going to be a very fine summer.